The state of U.S. education is such a mess that students are no longer required to read entire books. What's behind the dumbing down of Americans? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Billions upon billions of dollars are being pumped into the U.S. education system. Yet, education in the U.S. is a complete disaster. Reading and math scores suddenly dropped to the lowest level in decades. For those of you currently being educated in U.S. schools, a decade is a period of 10 years, and 10 is a number that comes after 9, but before 11. In places like Baltimore, a complete disaster might be a little soft. According to 2022 data released by the Maryland State Department of Education, 23 Baltimore schools had 0 students proficient in math. Stop and think about it for a moment. Not even one student in 23 high schools was considered proficient in math. But things aren't much better in the rest of Baltimore schools either. Just 7% of 3rd through 8th graders tested proficient in math, which means 93% could not do math at grade level. Even in the district's 5 top performing high schools, only 11.4% of students were math proficient. Of course, it's not just math. In 2022, the nation's report card found that just 15% of Baltimore school children were testing at or above proficient in reading. This was despite the fact that Baltimore City schools had a $1.7 billion budget that same year, with $799 million coming from COVID relief funding. The writing is on the wall. Unfortunately, no one in Baltimore can read it. Baltimore isn't alone. Schools across the nation don't fare much better. Under half of Minnesota students are proficient in reading and writing, while less than half of public school students in Oregon meet grade level standards in math, science, and English. And about 3/4 of Chicago public school students cannot read at grade level on the Illinois Assessment of Readiness in 2023. Nearly 83% did not meet proficiency in math. Whereas in Detroit, just 5% of students were considered proficient, yet 99% of teachers in that district were considered effective. Well done. Now I know it's easy to blame the pandemic for all this. Kids weren't allowed to even go to school in person, unless of course you were the child of a politician. But that's not the whole story. Even back in 2019, people had been raising the alarm about U.S. students lagging behind peers from around the world. According to the Director of Education and Skills at OECD, about 1/5 of American 15-year-olds scored so low on the PISA test, or Program for International Student Assessment, that it appeared they had not mastered reading skills expected of a 10-year-old. Even the kids at Hogwarts got better reading scores, and I'm pretty sure they don't even teach reading or writing there. Just spells and try not to get murdered 101. Seriously, the school had a high casualty rate. Why did parents keep sending their kids there? Anyway, what's going on? Are kids not eating their morning Wheaties anymore? Well, the U.S. had been struggling with education quality for decades. But as you can see in this graph by the National Center for Education Statistics, overall the U.S. had been improving student performance since the 1970s, especially from the 90s to 2010s. But then scores in math and reading nationwide stagnated. It was actually around 2015 that the U.S. started seeing scores slip across the board. So what happened around that time? Well, actually, the Brookings Institution points out that was the time period when all but a few states scheduled full implementation of Common Core standards. For those of you who don't know, Common Core is a set of education standards promoted by Obama and his administration. No longer were states aiming to get low-achieving students to basic literacy and numeracy. Now the goal was to get everyone to college and career readiness. Because it's not like you need to understand words or numbers in college or at a job, right? This has been a rare instance where many on both the left and right came together and criticized Common Core. One of the reasons is the way it lowered standards. Common Core pushed subjects like Algebra 1 into higher grades. It also did away with completing Algebra 2 and Geometry courses as prerequisites for being college ready. That's a weird angle to take on education, though I guess they wouldn't know since angles are taught in geometry and they didn't take it. After schools started implementing Common Core, states like California only saw modest increases in math and reading proficiency. Even then, only half of California students met English standards and fewer met math standards. But in states like New York, things took a turn for the worst. 5 years after Common Core was implemented, New York high schools' failure rates spiked from 25% to 30%. Now, correlation doesn't automatically equal causation. But the fact that so few New York students have any idea what that means shows it just might. And according to the Pioneer Institute, a conservative Massachusetts-based think tank, there's been a historic drop in national reading and math scores since the adoption of Common Core curriculum standards. Since 2013, fourth grade reading scores have been falling by less than half of a point each year, while eighth grade scores have dropped nearly a full point a year. In addition to the scores taking a dive, the way students are taught to think has also radically shifted for the worst. Common Core encourages students to read short poems, short articles, and passage excerpts from longer works, but it doesn't require reading entire books. In fact, the National Council of Teachers of English wrote in a 2022 statement, the time has come to decenter book reading and essay writing as the pinnacles of English language arts education. They've essentially been doing what TikTok has been doing to the attention spans of teens before TikTok was even a thing. But what does this mean in practice? Well, as The Atlantic puts it, where kids used to read and discuss whole books, they now get a few paragraphs at a time and then are prompted to answer a question. Reading has been distilled to practicing for a comprehension exam. So students are basically being trained to deal with short passages ripped apart from contexts and summaries handed down to them. Because who needs context? Sound bites, slogans, and headlines are all anyone needs to be informed. That's why American politics are so chill right now. Proponents for Common Core say this approach helps improve analytical thinking, but critics say it does the opposite. This isn't just affecting K through 12. It also has downstream effects. Look no further than college students today. One professor at North Central College in Illinois wrote in online magazine Slate that now students are intimidated by anything over 10 pages and seem to walk away from readings of as little as 20 pages with no real understanding. Even smart and motivated students struggle to do more with written texts than extract decontextualized takeaways. To which college students responded, could you say that with fewer big words in it, please? These days, that professor has to spend a lot of class time just explaining what happened in a story and the basic steps of an argument, something he did not have to do in the past. And he's not the only one observing this. Many are seeing that students are coming to college less able and less willing to read. Not even elite schools like Columbia University are immune to this issue. You'd think that students in those kinds of schools would be able to handle the daunting challenge of reading an entire book. Turns out they can't. One literature humanities professor at Columbia University told The Atlantic that his students now seem bewildered by the thought of finishing multiple books a semester. His colleagues have noticed the same problem. Many students no longer arrive at college, even at highly selective elite colleges, prepared to read books. Future judges are going to throw the book at defendants because they'll be scared and don't want to read them. One student told the professor that she had never been required to read an entire book in school. She had been assigned excerpts, poetry, and news articles, but never a single book cover to cover. When he heard this, the professor's jaw dropped. Other professors from Princeton, University of Virginia, and Georgetown told The Atlantic similar experiences. What are pretentious people going to say in the future after watching a movie? The excerpt was better? So how are schools adapting to get students better prepared before college? Why, they're doing what any reasonable person in that situation would do. Lower standards by changing minimum scores, eliminating honors classes, and students now no longer have to prove proficiency in basic skills, all in the name of preventing harm to students of color. Because nothing lifts people up more than lowering standards. You know, I think there's a word for when you think people of color aren't smart enough to get through school without lowering standards for them. But I just can't think of it. If that wasn't enough, Some colleges have even eliminated grades altogether. First, they weren't assigned books. Now they're not even being assigned letters. So after seeing all this, it makes sense that a vast majority of Americans believe public education is a disaster. They've seen the test results, and even though standards are being lowered across the board, things are still clearly headed in the wrong direction. So, what's the solution? Well, I certainly don't know. But I'm sure we can trust the government to come up with one. After all, government involvement in school has so clearly helped. Thank you for watching America Uncovered. And before YouTube's algorithm sends you off to some random video, in my ongoing attempt to hide controversial topics in gaming content, one of the ways Marxists try to destroy society is by destroying their culture heroes. The slandering of Columbus is a perfect example, which I talk about in this video on Diablo 4. Click here and let me know what you think. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.